Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georja Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the US pledges $200 million in humanitarian aid for Sudan. I speak to the US Special Envoy to the war-torn country about what difference his administration has and perhaps can still make to one of the world's worst wars. Also, Nigeria reels as more details emerge of the circumstances and heartbreak caused by a fatal crush at a school event. The gathering in Oyo State started off as a fun day, but ended in a stampede in which at least 35 children were killed. And Somaliland, a breakaway region of Somalia, and at its Hargeisa Cultural Centre library, cassettes have been lovingly kept, preserving more than half a century of its music, poetry, and political discourse. But first, the US has promised $200 million in humanitarian aid for the millions displaced and affected by the war in Sudan. War broke out there last April between the army, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the RSF paramilitary, led by his former deputy, Mohamed Hamdan Daglo, known as Hemeti. Tens of thousands have been killed, 11 million displaced, and it is the world's biggest humanitarian crisis. Now, whilst chairing a UN Security Council meeting on the conflict on Thursday, the US Secretary of State also pledged that Washington would do everything it could possibly do to hold those accused of abuse on both sides of the conflict to account. I'm joined now by the US's Special Envoy for Sudan, Tom Perriello. Tom, thank you so much for speaking to me. Now, first of all, just give us a bit of a sense of where things do stand currently when it comes to humanitarian access in Sudan, because that's been a real issue throughout the lifetime of the conflict.
Well, it has been. Just going back 5 months, you really had effectively a humanitarian embargo on 25 million or more Sudanese. Even though it didn't get a lot of attention, it was by far the largest crisis of its kind. 5 months later, we've had steady progress, working with our UN colleagues, working with the authorities in Port Sudan. We now have every major hard tarmac road into the country open. We've got some flights going. We're getting progress just today on a humanitarian corridor into parts of southern Khartoum that have not had emergency aid since the war began almost 2 years ago. Overall, we've seen a 400% increase in the amount of food and medicine getting in from that low point. But even with that, we are less than half of the way to where we need to be to try to prevent the kind of famine and malnourishment. So that gives you some sense of how bad things have been. That a 4-time increase still only gets us half of the way to where we need to be. And in the meantime, we've seen the violence continue, including the unconscionable shelling of the Zamzam camp, where up to 1.5 or 2 million innocent people are sitting in tight quarters. We have seen a pause, at least for a few days, from the RSF in that shelling. We must see the restoration of international humanitarian law, including humanitarian access, but also that protection of civilians.
I mean, you only met with Burhan, as far as I understand it, for the first time last month in Sudan. It's been hard going. How much faith do you have in either side's intention to truly try and find a negotiated way out of this?
We need them to come to the table with the political will to get out of the way of the Sudanese people. They join forces. Keep in mind, the two sides that are fighting now, the army and the RSF, actually joined forces to overthrow the civilian revolution that had put the country on the path to democracy. So what we really need is to let the Sudanese people determine their own future by restoring that democratic path. And today, Secretary Blinken promised an additional $30 million in support to the women and youth who are so clearly the future of this country, to be able to support that Sudanese dialogue, not just a ceasefire, but to a brighter Sudanese future. What
is the US's position in terms of the UAE? Because I understand that the administration has said that it's set a January 17th deadline for a final assessment on the UAE's promise that it's not selling on a lot of the weapons that they buy from the US to support the RSF in Sudan. And so you set this January 17th deadline, but up till now, there still seems to be a lot of pretty coherent evidence that the UAE is selling weapons to the RSF. So, this hedging of bets on the side of the US does seem at odds with its stated push to try and find a way out of the conflict.
Well, the United States hasn't done any hedging of bets. It's really led the way on putting pressure on those fueling both sides of this conflict, both inside and outside Sudan. We've called out the ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity by the Rapid Support Forces. We've called on those countries that are supplying weapons in, particularly through Darfur, where Linda Thomas Greenfield helped extend the Darfur arms embargo, and we're imposing those sanctions on the weapons flows, as well as calling out the role of Russia, not only in fueling the conflict, but standing in the way of solutions. As Secretary Blinken talked about today at the Security Council, we need more countries to join with the United States in imposing these costs on the individuals and the companies and the countries that are fueling this conflict, but also calling people to be partners in a peaceful process to rebuild the democratic future and the peace for Sudan. And I think this goes back to a long track record with the United States across both Republican and Democratic administrations, where we were very critical and called out the Janjaweed back in the day. We were critical of the SAF's decision to formalize a role for the RSF and then to invite them in as partners in the effort to throw off the civilian transition. So the United States has had a very clear track record on that. We are committed to the end of these atrocities. We are committed to that civilian democratic future. And unfortunately, we see too many actors coming in on both sides of the equation who want to not just fuel the war, but profit from it. We see former Bashir officials, former National Congress Party officials who've come back in on the SAF side and really need this war and need the suffering of the Sudanese people as an excuse to try to take back over ministries and the rest. We see some tribal leaders who should be powerful voices for peace instead of finding ways to profit from the war and from the suffering of the Sudanese people. There's a huge and unified will of the Sudanese people to end this war, end these atrocities, and get back to the dreams of the 2019 revolution. And the United States stands not just the Biden administration, but very strong Republican and Democratic support in Congress with that path.
What do you think is going to change in the change of administration in the US in terms of your country's position on what's happening in Sudan?
Well, as someone who's been working on these issues in Sudan for over 20 years, I can say that there's been a lot of consistency about the American people standing with the Sudanese people, of Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill, really wanting to speak out first and early against the atrocities in Sudan and be supportive of that democratic future. I can't speak for the president-elect and his team, but I can tell you there's an enormous amount of interest from both Republicans and Democrats on the Hill, as well as just from the compassion of the American people to continue to be supportive of things like Mutual Aid Sudan and the emergency response rooms and these efforts to take great risk to get food and medicine to their neighbors inside Sudan. So I think you'll see a lot of continuity and a lot of continuation, but we will see where the president-elect goes from there.
Tom Perriello, US Special Envoy to Sudan, thank you very much for your time. Well, the death toll from a stampede at a school fair in Nigeria has risen to 35. Clarice Fortuné tells us more.
Broken chairs, debris and decorations scattered on the ground. That's what's left on what should have been a great day for thousands of kids. Instead, this is the scene where tragedy struck. A large crowd had gathered for a family event in Ibadan, Oyo State's capital. It's still not clear what provoked a stampede, but thousands of children were attending. The Islamic high school that had organized the Children Fun Fair had promised to give cash, gifts, and food handouts, and 10,000 people reportedly turned up for the event, provoking a crush as they struggled to gain entry. As he visited the children who were rushed to hospital, the Oyo State Deputy Governor blamed the event organizers.
There's no way anybody in his right mind will organize an event of this nature without involving security apparatus. I mean, people are very safe and they are alive to what is happening around us. You can't cramp 10,000 people, children for that matter, in a place and expect them to behave normally.
At least 35 children were killed and 6 were injured. Some people were arrested. There have been several similar incidents, prompted by the promise of cash and food handout. 31 people died 2 years ago when hundreds of people who had turned up to receive food at a church early in River State broke through a gate, causing a stampede.
Well, finally, Somaliland's a breakaway region of Somalia, and at its Hargeisa Cultural Centre library, cassettes have been meticulously put aside to archive and preserve more than half a century of the music, poetry and political discussion of the self-declared nation. Clarice Fortuné has more.
The sound of another era. In this library in Somaliland's capital, Hargeisa, Hafsa Omer is discovering a part of a country's history. For the last 3 years, the 21-year-old has been painstakingly archiving and digitizing a collection of some 14,000 recordings at the cultural center.
I see it important because it's holding a whole history of my country. It's holding a whole history of my people, because my people, they never write, they never read. All they do is they talk.
Brought back, found or donated, the tapes contain more than half a century of the musical, cultural and political life of the region. Somaliland has run its own affairs since unilaterally declaring independence from Somalia in 1991, but remains unrecognized by any country.
This is just a proof to disprove those who say that Somaliland doesn't exist, because it shows that it exists. And putting these blocks together and making, the history is made by the people who were witnessing. The failure is that when we don't document, someone else creates another narrative.
Somalis have traditionally been nomadic shepherds, with culture transmitted orally from one generation to another. Somaliland has long been a center of music and poetry, with small tape recorders becoming widely available in the 1970s and 1980s. Somalilanders got into the habit of corresponding with exiled relatives via cassettes. Gathered around a tape recorder, they would recount intimacies of family life, but also survival during a decade-long war that culminated in the Declaration of Independence in 1991. Fewer than 5,000 recordings have been catalogued and only 1,100 digitized, leaving a titanic task for Hafsa Omer and her team, a real cultural odyssey in a place still searching for recognition.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us, though. Do so again. Take care.